My name is Coriana Beyer, and I'm a junior economics major and mathematics minor here at Hillsdale College. I'm also a proud member of Chi Omega Women's Fraternity, the Charger cheerleading team, and the Hillsdale College Tower Dancers. It is with great pleasure that I introduce William Walton tonight. William Walton is the managing partner of Rappahannock Ventures, Rush River Entertainment, and the Forge Studios. He is also vice president of the Council for National Policy and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Wealth, Poverty, and Morality. A former director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Walton earned his BS and MBA at Indiana University. He has served as chairman of the board and CEO of Allied Capital Corporation, and also as managing director of Butler Capital Corporation. He serves on several boards of directors, including the Heritage Foundation, the Media Research Center, and For America. Mr. Walton is a trustee for the National Gallery of Art and the president of the Washington, Virginia Volunteer Fire and Rescue Company. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in introducing William Walton.
Well, thank you. That was very kind. Boy, am I happy to be at Hillsdale. I've heard about Hillsdale. I guess we all have heard about Hillsdale through Rush's show, but standing here in front of this group is an incredible honor. I talked with some people at dinner tonight that I think knew more about what I'm going to talk about than I do. So when we get to the Q&A, I'm expecting a challenging time. We've got a debate coming up at 9 o'clock tonight, and Trump has gotten to me, so we're going to try to keep the remarks relatively short so we can get to Q&A. And so let's talk about cronyism. As Coriana mentioned, I've spent most of my career in Wall Street and in business. I was CEO of a New York Stock Exchange company, Allied Capital, basically a publicly traded private equity firm, highly regulated by the SEC. Our headquarters were just 3 blocks from the White House. I was also on the board of the Financial Services Roundtable, which is the 100 largest financial services companies. So in my experience, I've been both in the arena in the capital markets, but also have had a sort of front row seat to the comings and goings in Washington. And for reasons which will be clear later, I consider myself a recovering member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So we'll anyway, this is not all about the chamber, but this bears on their work. As I prepared this talk, I started out not wanting to tell a story of good and evil, greedy capitalists, intensive and coercive regulators, venal politicians, K Street lobbyists, versus the rest of us. And then, sort of the talk radio version of cronyism. And I didn't think it was that simple. But after digging into this issue, I think it is. We have a massive growing problem in America. It's a moral issue. It explains why economic growth is anemic, and it's a bipartisan issue. The problem is that the size and scope of the federal government is such that it's impossible to tell where business ends and government starts. The federal budget now is $4 trillion. Federal regulatory costs add up to another $1.7 trillion burden in the economy. There are 87,000 new federal rules that have been issued since 1993. And so business has a lot of interest and stake in what goes on in Washington. Businesses complain about regulation and intrusive, coercive government, but when they lobby for maintaining and increasing subsidies and mandates at the expense of taxpayers and consumers, they threaten public support for business and free markets. The growing incestuous relationship between business and government in America is a destructive force, undermining not just our economy and our political system, but the foundations of our culture. We have a term for this kind of collusion between business and government. It used to be called rent-seeking. Now we call it cronyism. Regulation and our incredibly complex tax code are big drags on business and economic growth. They're also the main vehicles and the means to suppress competition and keep new entrants out. I vastly oversimplify, but I think there are essentially two ways for a business to make money. One way is in the market, competing for customers in a free system of voluntary exchange. And the other way is petitioning the government for a special privilege, cronyism, such as subsidies for sugar or crops, for mandates for products like ethanol, other special privileges, and the list is long: grants, loans, tax credits, favorable regulations, bailouts, loan guarantees, targeted tax breaks, no-bid contracts. Governments also grant monopoly status, barriers to entry, and protection from foreign competition. I mean, it feels sort of like we've got Louis XIV as our king here. Less obvious, but also a form of cronyism, or occupational licenses, teacher certification, and school accreditation. I believe the right way to engage in economics is what economists call voluntary exchange. Voluntary exchange improves lives and makes the economy grow and causes free markets to produce the great results they have. In contrast to coercion and cronyism, voluntary exchange is the process where people willingly trade one item for another, making both better off as a result. The emphasis here is unwillingly. Apple has an iPad for sale for $500. You give them $500. They sell you the iPad. This is a voluntary exchange where both participants believe they're better off after the trade. This lies at the heart of free enterprise, market efficiency, and entrepreneurship. Individuals cooperate with each other, reach agreements, trade, and a network of relationship that emerges or evolves out of this trading process is called the market. Millions of voluntary exchanges every day make the world better off. They have the great virtue of being both moral and promoting economic growth. By contrast, taxes, government statutes, and regulations mandate involuntary exchanges. They rely on coercion. A harsh word, but try this out. Don't pay your taxes. See who shows up to seize your assets or put you in jail. And it's voluntary exchange that is most under the threat from the government and its crony partners. Whether it's the minimum wage, EPA regulations, abortion insurance mandates, or small business licensing, our entrepreneurial freedoms are being eroded. Increasingly, we were being told, for example, what we can sell, to whom we can sell it, and what wages and benefits we must provide. This is an increasingly poisonous, toxic mix for entrepreneurship, innovation, economic freedom, and growth. It also aids and abets entrenched incumbents. In the time we have here tonight, I can only give an overview and a few examples of what I mean. If you want to deep dive into the product of cronyism, and I might interject here, I thought I was going to be talking to all college students tonight, so those of you who are not, I've got some reading assignments for you as well. The first book, I think, is one of the essential books for reading. It's by Mancur Elson. It's The Rise and Decline of Nations, which explains paradoxically, the longer a society enjoys political stability, it's more likely to develop powerful special interest lobbies that in turn make it less efficient economically. It's the problem of factions that our founders knew about, where groups with concentrated interests form factions at the expense of the rest of society. He called it, and this is a $5 word, advanced institutional sclerosis. The second book, and it might be obvious, I've actually read these books. The second book by Charles Murray of the American Enterprise Institute, where I was a trustee, it's called By the People. It provides an excellent history and analysis of the end of what he calls the American project, the founding principle of America that people can be left as free individuals, families, and communities to live their lives as long as they see fit, as long as they accord the same freedom to everyone else, with government safeguarding a peaceful setting for those endeavors, but otherwise standing aside. He concludes that the normal political process will not restore us to a nation devoted to limited government and economic and religious freedom. He actually calls cronyism corruption. The third book I want to recommend is by George Gilder. He's the founder of Discovery Institute, where I serve as a fellow. It's called Knowledge and Power, and this is a much more optimistic book. It shows us that economic growth is driven by sudden, unexpected, revolutionary innovations driven by entrepreneurs. He described that left to its own devices, an entrepreneurial economy will rescue itself, while massive government interventions only disrupt the information loop between the market and entrepreneurs. He says everything useful or interesting depends on agents of change called entrepreneurs. Capitalism is not simply an incentive system, but an information system, and wealth expands through learning and discovery. Regulation and tax systems that seek to command and control the economy distort the market signals that innovation requires. Any system that protects old ways of doing things, cronyism, stifle innovation and growth. His optimistic message, though, is that an economic system can revive itself as quickly as minds and policies can change. This talk is titled The Problem of Crony Capitalism Today. I don't believe that American politicians, bureaucrats, and businesses today are more venal or dishonest than politicians or businessmen of the past. There has forever and always will be cronyism, people seeking special favors from government. What's changed is the scope and reach of the federal government. It's dramatically expanded. Before the 1930s, court interpretations and the general consensus in America was that the Constitution severely restricted the power of the federal government. Then a constitutional revolution occurred from 1937 to 1942. It dramatically expanded the federal government powers. There's not enough time to get into the details, but essentially there are three Supreme Court rulings that changed everything. The first allowed Congress to delegate its powers to federal agencies. The second gutted the Commerce Clause, giving the federal government power over regulating virtually all manufacturing and agriculture in the United States. Federal Judge Alex Kaczynski calls this, "Hey, you can do anything you feel like" clause. The third ruling, declaring Social Security constitutional, reinterpreted the General Welfare Clause to allow Congress to spend money on virtually anything. Fast forward to today. Unfortunately, I believe there's little chance these rulings can be reversed. As Charles Murray observes, to reverse any of these rulings would mean about 90% of everything the federal government does is unconstitutional, and that's just not going to happen. Before the New Deal in the 1930s, very few industries were affected by what went on in Washington. Only if you ran a railroad or a utility or were looking for tariff protection from foreign competition did you need to think about dealing with the federal government. The New Deal ushered in the Civil Aeronautics Board and the FCC and about a dozen other industry-specific agencies. But if you weren't in those industries, not much changed. And even by 1960, only a handful of corporations even had a small office in Washington. Then came Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society and a great pouring of regulations from Washington. Almost 30 pages were added to the Code of Federal Regulation by the end of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 brought about unprecedented federal oversight of employee hiring, firing, and promotion. But it was Richard Nixon who truly brought us the regulatory state. From 1970 to 1974, 16 new major regulatory agencies were established, including the EPA, the OSHA, and the powers of the EEOC were greatly expanded. What made these regulatory agencies different was that they were given economy-wide authority to regulate every business in the country. The number of pages in the Federal Code of Regulations had risen to nearly 175,000 by 2012. And on a parallel path, the federal tax code became increasingly complex, massively intrusive, with thousands of deductions, incentives, penalties, and specialty favors for virtually every industry in America. We now have a tax code that's 4 million words long. And how did business respond? They went to Washington. And by the end of the 70s, most major corporations and trades groups had set up offices in D.C. And here's the key point. As the regulatory state has grown, the role of politicians and their staff has changed and grown in power. They've added the role of liaison with the regulatory agencies to the business of working with legislation. With enormous power over the activities of the private sector, literally billions of dollars can be at stake for an industry depending on what Washington does or doesn't do. This is the principal cause for the cash flow of lobbying money going to K Street. As Charles Murray puts it, corruption in the political process varies directly with the number and value of things that politicians have to sell. That value has increased exponentially. Politics has now become a way to get rich. It's a seldom remarked fact of American politics that people in the top leadership positions, and this is what I see day in and day out in Washington, senators, cabinet officers, ranking members of the House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans alike, live a life utterly removed from the people they rule. The trappings of office include cars and drivers, private jets, four-star restaurants, skyboxes, all free. These people aren't carrying their own luggage. And most come to Washington filled with ideals and plans for change. Then the system corrupts them. As a friend of mine, Al Regnery, who's publisher of the American Spectator, puts it, they come to clean up the cesspool in Washington, then they discover it's a hot tub. A few years ago, I believe it was in 2006, I had my first personal direct experience with the lobbying culture in Washington. And it was here I learned that even politicians I believe are among the good guys get captured by how Congress works and how special interests work their agenda into legislation. As a CEO of a highly regulated financial company, I concluded, as many other CEOs do, that I needed to understand how the political process worked, and if nothing else, to protect our country's interest from harmful regulation and legislation. So we set up a political action committee, and I was invited to a PAC event sponsored by a senator that I had great respect for. I still do. He invited me down to a NASCAR event in Homestead, Florida. It was a weekend event. There were about 30, 40 people attending. I'd never been to a NASCAR race. I saw the Michigan Speedway here. If you've never been to a NASCAR race, you've got to go. It's the most exciting thing. Anyway, at the time, the transportation bill was in the works. It was a huge bill. It was loaded with pork, most of which wasn't about transportation. And the attendees, it turned out, were mostly lobbyists. I was the only so-called civilian there whose business wasn't lobbying. And as the weekend progressed, my senator friend sort of looked at me quizzically as if I was supposed to come up and talk to him about something. And finally, on Sunday, when we were getting ready to leave, he finally asked, he said, so what are you down here for? He said, well, you know, I'm down here. I want good judges, less regulation, tax reform. And he said, he looked at me and he smiled. He said, you're new to Washington, aren't you? And he said, everybody here has got something in the transportation bill. And they did, and they still do. You know, it seems like every time Congress passes one of these big new bills, it's intended to benefit incumbents, big business, entrenched interest, and ends up hurting small business and consumers. 3 bills spring to mind: Sarbanes-Oxley, DoddFrank, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Now, Obamacare is an interesting case. Its principal beneficiaries were to be the health insurance, hospital, and pharmaceutical companies, as well as some uninsured people. But as it turned out, yes, it brought some people into the insurance system, but at the expense of everyone else. And everyone else included meant the pharmaceutical companies and the hospitals and the insurance companies, which I think rue the day that they've got behind this bill. But people that are not ruining the day are the beneficiaries of DoddFrank. DoddFrank, as you recollect, came up after 2008. It was supposed to be aimed at Wall Street, punishing evildoers, and Instead, it hit Main Street much harder. Community financial institutions, which make the bulk of small business loans, are overwhelmed by the law's complexity. Government figures indicate that the country is losing, on average, one community bank or credit union a day. Compare this to the 100 new banks that entered the economy every year between 1990 and the financial crisis in 2008. From 2009 to 2013, there have been only 3 or 4 new banks that have started. It's absolutely put a hold on bank formation. And some reason for the decline, I mentioned increased compliance cost, regulatory compliance cost. For example, there's a small bank, United Southern Bank in Kentucky, about the same size as it was in 2009, but I had 15 back office workers to ensure compliance with new federal regulations. The Federal Reserve Board, I think you heard about that this afternoon. I mean, they've had a policy to manipulate money, keep interest rates at zero. And the beneficiaries have been the big banks. And the small banks, their net interest margins have been I won't say crushed, but certainly squeezed, and it's hurt them in addition to their compliance cost. And the really interesting number is it's going to take over 24 million man-hours per year, or person-hours, to comply with the rules imposed by DoddFrank. It took only 20 million hours to build the Panama Canal. Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein frankly tells us that Goldman is a big beneficiary of Dodd-Frank. He says the barriers to entry in the banking business are higher than at any other time in modern history. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, and I know these guys, has said the same thing, explaining that Dodd-Frank created what Warren Buffett calls an economic moat around the big banks, keeping competitors out. Tim Carney, who I think most of you know, writes for the Washington Times. He says regulation that Dodd-Frank protects the giants because politics and lobbying are home games for them. Goldman is famously close with Washington, and the revolving door between Goldman and its regulators is well trafficked. More regulation increases the value of lobbyists and lawyers, particularly the lobbyists and lawyers who used to be lawmakers or regulators. For example, he calls Wauwatosa Community Bank can't afford to hire many former members of the House Financial Services Committee. That would be Mike Oxley, for those that want me to name names. And this is a big problem because it's a big problem for the economy and why the economy is not growing. Look to something like the community banks, which represent the vast majority of banks and are critical because they are likely to make more small business loans than anyone else. They hold 46% of loans to farms and small businesses, where they only hold 14% of total industry banking assets. For rural communities, small banks are often the only lender since big banks are closing branches here. Sarbanes-Oxley. For decades, U.S. stock exchanges were seen by companies around the world as the most prestigious location to list shares. But the number of listings in the U.S. peaked at 8,884 companies in 1997. It's now down to roughly 5,000. And it's regulations such as Sarbanes-Oxley, Section 404, Reg FD that have had a chilling effect in companies wishing to go public in the U.S. But once again, Sarbanes-Oxley had little effect on the big companies, which could easily absorb the extra burden of the regulation. Let me give you an example. When a small company or a growth company wants to go public, regulatory costs can be as much as $4 or $5 million a year. For many of these companies, that's their profit. And so to go public kills their profit, increases the amount of time they need to spend complying with things, and they just don't go public. CEOs of the emerging growth companies choose instead to be acquired. Now, why is this a problem insofar as growth goes? Well, you may have heard some terms a few years ago called gazelles. They're emerging technology growth companies. And it turns out big companies in America don't create jobs. They're net destroyers of jobs. And all the job creation comes not necessarily from small business. It comes from emerging growth companies. And as they grow and innovate and expand, they add high-paying jobs rapidly. And it's those kind of companies that have disappeared from the IPO market since 2008. Oh, meanwhile, and this is interesting, we've only had 177 listings annually since 2008 in the U.S. The number of listings in China, 4,000. So lobbying has evolved from companies protecting themselves from such things as tax increases and regulations to using the political process to help them become more profitable. The classic case is the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003, which ushered in the Medicare drug benefits for elders. It's been estimated that the pharmaceutical companies that lobbied for this spent about $130 to $150 million. It's a lot of money. But the benefits are that the drug sales that they expect to reap from this in the 10-year period are roughly $200 billion, $200 billion. So, you know, many times what they had to spend to get the law enacted. But for me, the classic case is General Electric. We actually were in a joint venture with General Electric Capital. They're good guys, but if you look at the company, there are things that bother me a great deal. Last year's annual report, GE described itself as a new kind of industrial company. Well, that's for sure. In the last decade, GE spent well over $300 million lobbying, and Jeff Immelt, its CEO, has visited the White House over 33 times since Obama's become president. So why would the business spend this kind of time and money lobbying? Because it produces results. General Electric paid no federal income taxes from 2008 to 2012, and instead, it got a $3.1 billion in refund on $27.5 billion in profits during this period. It's received over $2 billion in federal loan guarantees for wind and solar projects. It was a big recipient of the bank bailout TARP money, notwithstanding the fact that GE Capital is not a bank. It was paid subsidies of $132 million for a lithium battery company that ended up in bankruptcy. And of course, one of the most effective ways to lobby is to wrap your special interest in a cloak of some public good. In the name of protecting the environment, GE was one of the principal advocates of energy legislation that effectively outlawed the incandescent bulb, replaced, of course, with the LED bulb. What this bought GE was it was able to get out a low-margin, unprofitable incandescent bulb business and into the much more high-margin, profitable LED business. Before the legislation, consumers balked at the higher prices for LED, but with the law, we're now all forced to pay up. In another loudly proclaimed show of giving back, GE donated $30 million to New York City schools. $11 million went to Charlie Rangel's district. Somebody knows this punchline. Anyway, at the time, Charlie was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, overseeing, what else? Corporate taxes. What a coincidence. On the Charlie Rose show, Immelt praised the communist government of China, saying, state-run communists may not be your cup of tea, but their government works. He also told shareholders that in a reset economy, the government will be a regulator, but also an industry and policy champion, a financier, and a key partner. The interaction between government and business will change forever. Yes, GE is a new kind of industrial company. So, are there solutions to the pervasive and growing problem of cronyism? If so, I believe they need to be big ones, radical ones. Tinkering with things like term limits, revolving door lobbying, campaign finance reform, I don't believe are likely to change much so long as trillions of dollars are at stake for people who do lobby or engage in cronyism. Mancur Olson believed there's only one way to cure advanced institutional sclerosis: be utterly defeated in a world war. His examples, Japan and Germany. They were forced to start over after World War II, so they got rid of all the institutional barriers to growth and in fact had growth economies through the 50s and 60s. Charles Murray advocates massive civil disobedience, although, as somebody pointed out tonight, it's a rather civilized form of civil disobedience, where lawsuits would be underwritten by privately funded multi-billion-dollar defense funds that would sue government and cronyists. George Will argues that we need to zero-base the budget every year, or zero-base every agency's budget on a 3-year cycle, so that they have to come back every 3 years and show that they're doing something worthwhile. And if you don't think this is feasible, he points out how New Zealand did it after World War II and turned their beef industry or their cattle industry into a world leader by basically sunsetting the regulators for the industry. He'd also sunset all regulations after 10 years. I would start with getting rid of the tax code, the income tax code, and replacing it with a flat tax or fair tax. That would eliminate tax code cronyism, and it would ignite the economy in a way that we just wouldn't believe. 4% growth would be low. Whatever we do, and I'm not advocating being heavily defeated in a world war, we need to think big. We need to act now. And I'm hoping some Hillsdale graduates will lead the charge. Thank you. Okay, well, I hope I was able to stimulate some questions or some challenges or some other thoughts. Got a lot of smart people here. We got one here.
That's all right. Thank you very much for your time, sir. Quick question. What's happened to the U.S. Department of the Chamber of Commerce?
I've got a story. I joined because I thought they were doing some good things with the capital markets, and they've got a litigation fund aimed at the trial lawyers. But they put me on their PAC committee, and I went to a PAC meeting. This was in 2010, and it was the summer of 2010, and we had the makings of a wave election, so the Republicans could take back the House. And I went to this meeting, and again, I'm a civilian in these meetings. I'm not a professional lobbyist, and so I was in there, and we're going down the list of congressional candidates that they wanted to support in this cycle. And I'm walking in thinking, this is a slam dunk. We've got to support every Republican in the race because we want to eliminate 2 words from the vocabulary, Speaker Pelosi. And so about 45 minutes into the meeting, what's been happening, we're going down this list of candidates, and they're giving money to everybody in the most promiscuous way. They're giving money to Democrats that have they have scorecards, and they rank only 25 out of 100 on the Chamber's scorecard, and Republicans that didn't do that much better. And I then sort of stopped the meeting, and I said, I think we're going at this the wrong way. We need to support every Republican because we can't have Pelosi as leader. We've got to get a majority. And boy, the outrage that caused. I mean, the other people in the room, they just said, look, we've got to work with these people. They're viable. We've got to do this stuff. We can't take a principled position if we're going to be effective. And I think I was on the board for another few months. I mean, it just. And that's the issue. I mean, I think people may come to Washington with principles, but they certainly don't keep them very long because the system doesn't really reward principled behavior. I mean, it even happens to the new congressmen that come into town. I mean, we've talked with a lot of them. The guy Meadows, who went through hell this summer, they cut you out of key meetings. They take your legislation. They basically ostracize you, and they tell you, if you want a committee or if you want a bill passed, you've got to learn how to play the game and play along. And so within even ferocious freshman congressmen that came in 2010 and 2014 they're taught how to play the game the way the leader wanted them to play. Hopefully Ryan will be better. But the chamber, they're not a force for a positive change. Yeah, back there. We're over here.
If you go back to Enron, was Enron reverse crony capitalism? Because I was thinking back to this past week where the Attorney General of New York decided to RICO Exxon as misrepresenting their liabilities under global warming to the stockholders. But Enron was an example of a company that had paid off every politician in the country. So how did Enron end up like Enron, and is what is happening in New York to Exxon part of crony capitalism, or is it the old Roman principle where the emperor condemns a wealthy person as a traitor and then kills him and then confiscates all his property?
Well, let's take Enron first. Enron was a company that had no cash flow, and they had accounting treatment that made it look like they were profitable. But if you looked at their balance sheet, they had no cash flow and no ability to survive, and they kept the plate spinning. And I think when somebody said the emperor had no clothes, it collapsed, and they didn't have you couldn't have enough friends to save Enron. It was just such a catastrophe. Exxon, I don't know. There are probably other opinions here. I think Exxon's been on the wrong side of some things. It's a little more conservative than Shell, and you know, the thing about regulators, and I had to deal with them a lot, is that they're vindictive people. They're individuals. You know, Charles Murray makes this point in his book. I mean, you think of these regulatory monoliths and this agency and that agency. In practice, you're only dealing with 2 or 3 or 4 people, lawyers, whatever they are, that get an agenda, and then they work the agenda, and you hear, well, the EPA is coming after them, or the Department of Labor, things like that. It's usually a handful of people that are largely unsupervised that do a lot of this. So there may be personal things going on there that I don't know about. I don't know. Do you have a follow-up on that? I'd love to hear what you think, except for the senator part. Anyway, another question? Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on the H-1B visas regarding crony capitalism, whereby they're bringing skilled and computer-trained individuals from countries like India and kicking out highly trained computer American people in this country, obviously. Disney is an example. Some of the high-tech companies out in California. And it's even from what I listen a lot to talk radio, Laura Ingraham is pointing out it's going to drop down to where your friendly local mechanic may be able to pass the requirements to come in here and kick American workers out of their jobs and lower wages in general for the total American economy based on these H-1B visas. Are you into that at all, or following the really strong impact, especially in Silicon Valley, and Disney's another example, and other places throughout the U.S.?
Are you saying we ought to be hiring Americans only? Or
Yeah,
we should,
well, yeah, I mean, we've got trained people who they're required to train these people from India in what they do. They've got computer science degrees, for example, and if they don't train them, they're kicked out right now. After they're done training, they get their severance and their goodbye pay.
Well, I think Ann Coulter and Mark Levin have got I used to be a free trader, and I think we've unilaterally disarmed. And I think that's one of the reasons Trump has become popular, is he's saying things that are true about losing jobs. And there are plenty of engineers in America that could be hired, and I'm not quite sure what the you get the people in Silicon Valley, and they get their own little culture, and they want to bring people in that are just like them, and they forget the rest of America. And I don't think we should do that.
The story you just told seems to come straight out of Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Have you ever read that book?
I think I lived that book.
And if you haven't, you should. We all should.
Yeah.
Many times over.
Well, I think we've. Who was the evil guy at Ellsworth Toohey and Atlas Shrugged? Anyway, he was the Fountainhead. They had a similar code in Atlas Shrugged. Well, it feels like that. I mean, the regulators and the cronies and the I guess the Fountainhead springs to mind more. I actually read the whole Fountainhead. I never quite finished Atlas Shrugged, but it does feel like that. I mean, that's why I summarize with radical solutions. I think a litigation fund, or Colin Hanna from Let Freedom Ring has got something he's trying to push called Sunset the Tax Code. The thing we're worried about is if we push to get rid of the tax code, we'd end up with a fight over whether it's a flat tax or fair tax or value add tax, and we would agree to sunset the tax code at date certain, say 2018, 2019, and then engage in a debate, public policy debate about what we want to replace it with, because there are good arguments on both sides, but the 4 million words of the Internal Revenue Code is something we've got to do something about. And I'd add with the Internal Revenue Code, I think we can win on this because it's a fairness issue. Even though 47% of Americans supposedly aren't paying income taxes, they do have to deal with the tax code. And they also feel that the tax code is riven with special interests so that their neighbor's getting a better deal than they are. And everybody feels it's unfair. And even people getting earned income tax credits who are getting paid from the Internal Revenue Service are getting put through hoops. And so nobody likes it. It's a winning political issue. And I think that's one area where we could really unite people, maybe on both sides of the argument, to do something about that.
Thank you very much for your talk. You know, Adam Smith opined that the real threat to capitalism was capitalists who would try to use their money to limit competition. Schumpeter thought that capitalism would succumb to its own success. My question is relative to the bailout of AIG. Henry Paulson, obviously from Goldman, and we all know that Washington, D.C. has become a revolving door for Goldman Sachs executives. He let Lehman go under, but he bailed out AIG, which most of us think was a stealth bailout of Societe Generale and Goldman because of the derivative exposure that Goldman had, that AIG had supposedly backed and underwritten. Blankfein says that, well, they had it cross-collateralized, so it wasn't any big deal. But my question to you is, do you think that Henry Paulson, being a ex-Goldman executive, had anything to do with the bailout of AIG, and would you consider this crony capitalism?
Yes to both. I mentioned I was on the board of the Financial Services Roundtable, and that was a very interesting place because my company's market cap was about $6 billion, and everybody else's was about $6 trillion. And so I was in the meetings with Jamie Dimon and all these people, and I remember when Paulson came in to meet with us in September of 2008. He came to visit with us 2 or 3 times. He was a hulk. There was no, he doesn't drink, but I would have thought the guy was just, there was nothing there. He was on fumes. And I thought, gee, this is the guy who's making policy for America. And do I think they're personal agendas that these guys have? Yeah. They didn't like Dick Fold. I used to work at Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb. And, Lehman Brothers made itself very unpopular. We were surprised when Bear Stearns got bailed out because Bear Stearns wouldn't participate in some of the things that they wanted him to do. And I do think, did anybody read that book about the hedge fund too big to, what was it was the hedge fund, anyway. There was a famous hedge fund that collapsed, and I can't remember, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Long-term capital. And, they had their book, and Goldman was hired to bail them out. And instead of bailing them out, they had some guy with a computer finding out what all their positions were. And so Goldman was trading against their own client. So if any of you are planning to go to work for Goldman Sachs, see me after the talk. You don't want to let them know you know me. Yeah. Oh, yes, yeah.
Would you care to comment on what the Council for National Policy is doing or could be doing or should be doing to restore the American dream?
Well, our next meeting, and I invite you all to come, we're calling it Preserving or Protecting Civil Society. And what we believe is that the family, marriage, Boy Scouts, police, military is all being deconstructed by the left. And we've got to develop, we've got to talk a common voice on that. We've also ramped up our recruiting efforts. We want to bring in more of the people who go to things like the Koch seminars, where we want to get them directly involved with people involved doing things in the cultural area. But the thing we've got to do, and the thing I'm interested in trying to help, is we need to get more wood behind the tip of the spear, because at Council of National Policies, we've got 400 members. They're all doing amazing things, but each one of them individually is under-resourced. And if I could do any one thing to help, it would be try to bring more capital to bear on the organizations that might really make a difference. So, Council for National Policy, I don't know, you all know it, you probably haven't heard of it, was formed in 1981. Ronald Reagan asked this group of people to form it. I can't remember who the founders were, but it was a very illustrious group of people, and they acted kind of as a kitchen cabinet outside the government to help move things along in policy matters in both national defense, social issues, and economic issues. And we're now ramping that back up to see if we can't make a difference in the policy debate.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. You mentioned earlier how a lot of smaller emerging businesses are launching an IPO and going public to be acquired by a bigger company. So my question is, in the modern technological market, there's a lot of tech startups today that would rather be bought out by bigger companies like Facebook or Google rather than launch an IPO. Do you think that's negative to the job market as well? And if so, how would you correct a problem like that?
Well, for years what happened in the technology business, venture capital, everybody wanted to go public. It was a badge of honor. You get your picture on one of the Inc. magazine or something like that. And being public and being a CEO of a public company puts you in a superstar status. How long ago was that? And then after the regulatory changes that DoddFrank brought about and a lot of other things that have happened, it's become increasingly unattractive to be public. And unless you're really a big company that can afford all the compliance costs, you're incredibly financially burdened. But more than that, the bigger problem is this. I remember one of the board meetings I was in where I was with my board, and we'd had a meeting. It was a 3-hour meeting, and we were finishing the meeting, and I said, I'm afraid we're going to have to ruin a perfect meeting. And they kind of looked at me and they said, I said, well, look, we've covered audit, we've covered compliance, we've covered the SEC, we've covered our employee policies. We're now going to have to talk about the business. And that's the issue when you're in that environment. There's so many other things that are not related to creating a great product or service or building your team that you just don't, the public company is not conducive to that. And so I think, yeah, it's a big problem. And it's a big problem specifically with jobs, because the companies that were going public in the 80s and 90s, they were growing like a weed, and they were innovating, and they were adding employees, and they were paying them a lot. And I don't remember the statistics. Kauffman Institute in Kansas, I think, has come up with the numbers, but something like 90% of all the jobs that were created during that period were created by 500 companies. And that's just a fact, and we're not seeing that now. And I would say that's one of the reasons we're not seeing the growth in the economy, and we're not seeing the creation of good jobs. John Chambers, I went to business school with, ended up running Cisco. Great guy, great entrepreneur, great CEO. But his business model was, if there was a good company that could help Cisco, they'd buy the company, they'd get the technology, they'd get the brand name, and then they didn't need the people. And so yeah, so it's a big issue, and I would lay it back to the regulations that came out that made it unattractive to be public.
Just like to thank you for speaking tonight. You mentioned toward the end of your speech the idea of sunsetting regulation every few years. You gave the example of New Zealand and the cattle industry there as one example that was successful. I'm not really familiar with it, but my initial instinct would be that this would increase the incentive for companies and corporations to lobby, bringing regulation up every couple of years for discussion. It seems like that could have harmful impacts in the economy as far as the allocation of capital spent on lobbying rather than productive means. Could you just comment on that?
You're probably right. I mean, the thing we know about all these laws or all these changes in Washington, anything you do now, as I hope I conveyed, the government and the business community are so interconnected, and every industry has its regulator or whatever like that. Any change like that is going to cause everybody to try to come to Washington and, get an outcome that benefits them. So you may be right, but I think, I'd want to get in a room with a lot of smart people to figure out whether we could craft something that wouldn't have that unintended consequence. Remember, we've got a constitution, I think it says something about being a petition to government. I mean, lobbying abstractly is something we ought to be able to do. It's just in practice, because of the growth of the government, that it's become so odious.
Hi. I was just wondering if you've read Donald Trump's tax plan, and if you have, do you think it'll be as bad for the debt as a lot of the experts are saying it will be?
I don't think I'd really call it a plan. No, I've not studied his plan. The plan I really liked, even though he's not my candidate, was Marco Rubio's plan that was written by Art Laffer and Steve Moore and Larry Kudlow, and it eliminates the code altogether, starts over, and puts a flat tax on personal income, and it's got kind of a value-added VAT tax for corporations, and it's great for corporations. Would rapidly increase the incentives to invest, even though it actually raises the taxes on corporations. So with Donald, we hope, I asked Donald a question. We were at a meeting, and I was asked Donald, income inequality has risen dramatically in the last 5 years, and while the middle class is really struggling. Can you, given your wealth, explain why that happened? And he wouldn't let me finish the question because he wanted to get on to something else. And I gave him the answer. I said the reason income inequality has become an issue is that the Federal Reserve monetary policy has caused asset prices to go way up, which has benefited wealthy people, but it hasn't helped anybody else in the country. And so incomes are stagnant. People aren't in the stock market are seeing their asset values flat or down. So I don't know. I hope I didn't answer your question the right way.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. Yeah, Donald wants us to pay attention.
I was just wondering if you could comment on, I have been told by many intelligent people on both sides of the aisle that the only way anything will ever get fixed is revolution. Given that business and government is so interconnected, they might as well be symbiotic. Do you think that is true, that the only way to solve anything these days is start over and, yeah.
Short of being massively defeated in a world war?
Basically. I've been told many times that basically Texas needs to secede for anything to get done.
Well, I don't know that it's a revolution, but what is it? Anything that can't continue forever won't. And, you run the math on our deficits and you run the math on the growth and the bad stuff that we all worry about, and I don't think it can continue forever, but I don't know what the catalyst would be to unwind that. And you get something like that, you can end up with a really bad outcome. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, that didn't turn out so well. So You know, the revolutions get captured by bad people. Yes, my wife. Oh yeah, Sarah points out to me. Sarah points to me. I really think we're not conservative. I think we're the counter-revolution, and that we're counterculture. And I know Jenny Beth Martin, who's chairman of the Tea Party Patriots, or CEO of the Tea Party Patriots, and their headquarters is in Woodstock, Georgia. And I said to Jenny Beth, Jenny Beth, you really ought to use that Woodstock in your brand because you're the counterculture now. And the people at the other Woodstock are all working for the Justice Department trying to put us in jail.
Thank you very much.